Well, let's see who's going to be able to lock themselves in. Of course, Lucifer looking like a front runner, already cozy in his seats, taking notes between these two. Vortix, a familiar face, considering his bro is always his scrim partner. But Beasty, can he surprise here? Let's find out as we hop into game one of our final lower bracket game in round one of Golden League 2.
And, look at that. Mosque start right at the beginning here for Vortix. Beautiful little base here on Basin. He's got bears at the back. Woodline at the back as well. Also has a forward forest, so he's kind of sheltered from the front. Goldmine a little too to the side, but probably not a big deal for him, unless Beasty plays very aggressive here in Dark Age, trying to deny that.
Yeah, because sometimes we do see Ottoman players open up with the military school into Spearman. Occasionally, I've even seen a few players go for racks if they just want to spam Spearman up the wazoo. That tends to be on more of those water hybrid maps, though, right?
It is. And there is the military school out there for Beasty, no surprise in this. This is one of the challenging matchups for both civilizations, quite frankly. Both of these civs known for having a high output of units in mid-game, that Zerg-style approach that they have. And you probably don't want to be in a position where both of you are Zerging and one of you will eventually lose the game. You want to build up some lead so that you can just outmass your opponent mid-game.
And there's interesting dynamics between these two civs, right? And the few layers that we know that we're going to get into quite quickly with these two. On one side, you have got the attack speed aura for the Ottomans. On the other, you can get that, but you do forgo the ability to get cheaper scholars. The interesting part, though, is that healing factor, something that I feel like we've seen less of ever since the recent changes to the way combat healing works.
Indeed, that's a big factor, and that actually raises the question of whether you go for a Tower of Victory here for Vortix, because that's one way to offset the matter buff on one side, and if you can pick off those matters, that's also a direct way to have an edge over your opponent as well. So there is a chance here for Vortix to go for the Tower of Victory simply because, as you said, combat healing has been nerfed, and this matchup is all about those battles in the middle, all about taking one crucial engagement and building an upper hand in terms of military.
Yeah, and I think Tower of Victory can really be exploitable when you go mass archers, which, when you play the Ottomans long feudal, you kind of have to go for archers, right? Otherwise, similar to how people need to go archers against Delhi to snipe out the scholars, if you don't go for ranged units against the Ottomans, you have no way of killing those metas.
Yeah, that's the key thing, right? And once you go for archers, you might as well go Tower of Victory, especially because the Ottomans will also go very heavy on the archers, possibly supplemented by some Sipahi. So you definitely want that big ball of archers on both sides.
And that might be an exploitable detail for Beasty, right? We have seen some players switching up into Sipahi heavy build, where instead of just passively producing them, you drop one or two stables. If Vortix doesn't scout that out early, maybe it catches him off guard. But on the opening, we are going to see Vortix going into the TOV. I've noticed a lot more people still sticking around for the Dome of Faith, but I think part of that is due to the fact that you can't go for compounded defenders, so the fast castle builds off the table. But also part of it seems to be when you're up against these civs that force that extra juice in your early units, like the Ottomans, and also in Delhi mirrors that we see frequently.
For sure, and as you pointed out, while you technically are allowed to go for a compound of the defender, it's not like it gives you any massive buffs, because the rules that we play by right now is that you can't make keeps or stone walls. So, as you said, basically no use for a compound of the defender. That also has an impact on the early game of Vortix and the Delhi.
I actually think that going for this TOV after Beasty makes the spin play favors Beasty a little bit, because what you've essentially done is you've forced an opponent who doesn't have the ability to get cheap scholars to delay his research timings by addressing this harassment with healing.
Yeah, that's a great point, indeed. Vortix is going to have mostly the gold he needs, so it's not like it's a terrific amount of damage, but for the investment that Beasty has made, this is perfectly fine. Feudal Age timings will be next to identical, and this Spearman is not only there to harass, it's also there to give some level of insight into the base layout of the opponent, because if I'm not mistaken, Beasty's scout is not actively scouting the opponent's base.
He's off gathering sheep, I assume. Right, he wants to play condensed. It's interesting actually because I think Beasty, he could have went for a trade play. I've seen a few players, Ottomans and French on this map, attempt it just to force a reaction. But I guess when you're up against the Delhi, there's an anticipation that they will fight you in feudal anyway, so you don't need to bait them into it per se.
Yeah, the other thing is that while you probably expect a big ball of archers from the Delhi, they will support those with horsemen. It's just a matter of time. So, especially when Vortix, or if Vortix spots a trade play, then he would just go a little heavier on the horsemen. It would be difficult for Beasty to keep those alive.
And that's another area where the Ultimate player has an edge in this matchup, right? It's like if the Deli have to go into Horseman with a TOV build, you have no way of juicing up the attack speed of this Horseman, as TOV only affects infantry. Meanwhile, the Ottomans, that meta ups the attack speed of basically everyone. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if Scholars start glowing. Wouldn't have an effect on them, but they would look cooler.
All right, Beasty going on Stone, though. Do you think we could see just a second? Well, I would assume it's just going to be an additional military school, but could you possibly imagine a slightly greedier play, maybe playing 2 DCs? We have seen players play 2 DCs on this map, not necessarily with the Delhi or the Ottomans, but this is definitely one of those maps where you can consider being greedy.
I think the generation could allow for it, right? You could play a TC into your back deer spawn. You couldn't go for the northern one, though. It'd be a little bit too aggro. I think BC just wants to kind of keep it straightforward with the military school escalation. Because we have to remember, like, if you go for the TC, it's not just the initial investment into the town center, it's then an extra 150 food per minute that you're burning to gradually get an eco advantage.
Yeah, I think it's a risky call for him, so I would just assume he goes for a second military school, simply because you would expect Vortix to play very aggressively over here. And so far, the eco distribution shows that basically just food and wood villagers out there for Vortix, so no desire to go to Castle Age just yet. No gold miners, nothing whatsoever. It's all about pumping out those archers and possibly horsemen, although he's also going for the spearman upgrade.
Yeah, I think he just wants to force all reactions, right? So Vortix, you know, he's prepping for the next step where Vortix could go into the horsemen. Sipahi are now being pushed as well by Beasty. I mean, I quite like his position here, though. I think we're kind of seeing the crux of like the situation with Vortix now, where he wants to switch across to the spears. You know, it took him longer to get the upgrades. Then we've got to think about blacksmith upgrades. When you don't go for Dome of Faith, you do run the risk of your opponent beating you on the blacksmith upgrades. And the Ottomans are, of course, always going to build in early blacksmiths because they need it for the increased production rates.
Yeah, Beasty just going for the second military school out there. Also has 100 stone in the bank left over, so it's going to be utilized later in the game. Vortix, he's going to have 1 guaranteed sacred site, and I guess part of the reason why you can afford to go for the TOV here is because you know that you will have that 1 sacred site, so there's going to be some passive gold trickle, and it's less about the fact that you have to contest map control, risking the life of your scholars as you capture sacred sites.
That's true. Although initially, like, one of the issues you run into is your initial timing is a little bit delayed compared to where it'd be otherwise, right? Because at this point, if there's a Dome of Faith build, I'd expect a Delhi player to probably have almost 4 scholars already, just because of how much cheaper they are.
Yeah, looks like it's gonna be a retreat for the time being for Beasty. Numbers looking slightly better for Vortix, and this could actually prompt a move towards the sacred site in the middle. Now, if Vortix does that, I would love to see a tower being there too. It's gonna provide vision, and it's also gonna be a really good staging point, something that will also help defend that sacred site, of course.
I really like the idea of, like, if BC can eventually force Vortix off of going into archers. Like, there's definitely going to be a composition element that Vortix always wanted to keep. But right now, like, his goal is to probably be maybe 40-50% archers and the rest between melee. Because if you can force Vortix off that many archers, one cool play the Ottomans have that we've seen utilized more and more recently is the Imam spawn. Imam spawns, which, by the way, even though combat healing got nerfed, the AoE passive heal hasn't been. It's still 1 health a second, even when you're fighting.
Yeah, that could be a thing to consider. Or if Vortix is playing a more passive gameplay, you could even consider going into Castle with the Imperial Armory and think about men-at-arms. I think that would be a little too risky for Beast right now, but especially if it's kind of that poke and probe style gameplay that we see right now for the next few minutes, Beasty might actually consider that option too.
And you've seen that evolution there, right? Like, a while ago, not too long ago, in fact, it would be weird to see Ottoman players dropping double stables at this stage. But the cool thing is when you go for the Madrissa, and when you have the access to the back deer, if things get a little bit frugal in your base, you have the ability to just churn out so many. I mean, Sipahi really are an absurd unit when you break it down. A 50% increased attack speed negated by the fact that you take 50% more damage. So it's only a potential positive, right? Because if you find a situation where your opponent can't fight back, or you have more units than your opponent, it's always a net win.
Lovely use of the scout here by Beasty, by the way. Vortix was hiding his forces in the stealth forest, but Beasty still has his scout back at home. He saw exactly those units hiding in the stealth forest, and he's ready for him.
Beasty willing to take the clash right here. Archer on the backside, more or less protected, but the horsemen will wiggle their way through. Beasty will just try to reset and cover the escape here. Wants to trade out the best he can. Now, he's the defender, so he should have somewhat of an edge, but it's got to be said, Vortix seems like he's somewhat caught Beasty off guard with the amount of horsemen he brought in here.
It's also the Spearmen. The Sipahi are just getting massacred by them, and that's probably the thing that gives the big edge here to Vortix. Full retreat coming in here from Beasty. Matter is still alive, but that's a big W for Vortix. And keep in mind, he actually captured the sacred site right next to the battlefield. That's the level of confidence we had for Vortix here in this fight.
And it's actually incredible the way Vortix is utilizing that stealth forest. You mentioned it around the scouting vision, the lack of on one side. But the fact is, most players don't necessarily leverage this, even with a Deli as a pick. They don't tend to sit in the stealth forest and hold a sacred site hostage the way Vortix just done. And even with it now being decapped, we have to remember the way this works. The moment you capture it, you get a little bit of gold. So even if you don't hold it for the minute, you're happy.
Exactly, especially because you didn't lose a scholar doing so. So it was a net win for Vortix. And Beasty, obviously, for the time being, will just decap that. But that means that Vortix is more than happy having 2 sacred sites. And if you look at his resource income per minute, this is the window where he could start thinking about possibly going castle. In 1 minute's time, he's gonna have enough resources for that. And right now, Beasty is not in a position to punish him for doing so.
I actually don't mind the idea of just like double downing on this timing, right? Because you're gradually scaling scholars, so maybe you can even afford to have a few of them come out and start healing any injuries. And after you kiss the boo-boos better, you just take 1 or 2 of these type of fights, and all of a sudden Beasty's in trouble. Not to mention the fact his whole production line is on his front side of his base, which is why you may notice Vortix has started researching siege engineering.
Ooh, so he's gonna double down on this. I'm not against that either. As you said, this is a Zerg versus Zerg style approach. It's all about building that military mass, and right now Vortix has a 2-to-1 army advantage, plus 2 sacred sites. So, as you said, you could easily double down on this, especially if Beasty decides to go for a raid with the Sipahi. His base could be very much defenseless.
Vortix just has so many spearmen. It's kind of insane here. You know, some people might look and go, that's a little bit overkill for the amount of supply he's up against, but you gotta remember that attack speed, that movement speed, you can lose probably half of them before you even touch spears against something. So I love the fact that Vortix isn't kind of, you know, nickel and diming on his combo tool.
Yeah, this is actually a nice little move over here, although I'm not sure if this was deliberate by Beast. It looks like it is. For a moment, it seemed like the Sipahis are just going in to raid, harass a little bit, and then he just runs into the sacred site to reveal those positions, but looks like he also wanted to just be a little annoying trying to decap this, but that's not gonna happen. One Spearman should scare him away, but this is a nice little Sipahi move. So annoying for Vortix to deal with. Might actually need to pull the villagers to fight this.
It's one of those annoying situations where if BC had both of them there, then the villagers can't even fight, right? Like, Vortix just has to run immediately. But looks like because Vortix is a little bit paranoid, doesn't know if there's more supply behind this, he's going to kind of start a step back until he sees that Beasty is full strong army in the center. Which is what he's about to see in Beasty. He did get a glimpse of that, so he now understands that Vortix has burnt 500 wood unless he can now use it.
Exactly, lovely reaction by Beasty. The moment he sees the rams, he rallies his forces back at home, knowing what's happening. Now, the question is whether Vortix anticipates the entire army being back there. I think he does, and he's gonna have to fight this.
Clash will begin here. Upgrade's still coming through, but at this point, we are noticing that you got the steel tip upgrade. No, Undermesh. Well, no, Undermesh is there. Ignore me. Vortix is going to be fine. Dive comes in, wrap around. Just so many horsemen here. And look at the cutaway. Beasty has to leave the archers behind. Ram's now moving in. This is a good exchange for Vortix, but he needs to keep momentum on his side. Continues to push in. Archers just trying to snipe out the remaining spearmen, but even if they do, Beasty is still going to have to clash with a horseman on horseman situation here. It will give Vortix the edge.
And the spearmen, they are just deciding the battle. So difficult to focus down those with the archers. Nothing left here for Beasty. Buildings lit ablaze by the rams, and this might be it. Nothing left on the battlefield for Beasty. Production buildings now getting taken down, and there is just no reinforcements coming in for him anymore.
That's it. It has to be done here. Beasty has no way of reclaiming this. Not the fact that you lost the blacksmith. Vortix prioritized that. Shut down any type of production device and ensured that Beasty would be booted out of game one quickly as Vortix takes the dub.
The spearman play in both of those critical fights was just vital. You look at the compositions and you say, okay, Beasty can snap them down, but it's easier said than done. So difficult to focus that spearman, especially in the first engagement, which was even in the stealth forest. Difficult to click those spearmen, and the Sipahi just got massacred by them. And that first engagement sets up Vortix to be in an advantageous position, and from that point on, it was just a matter of escalation and finally finishing the battle here.